So, imagine being a British soldier on the morning of August 6th, 1757.
Hmm.
You are trapped inside this really cramped wooden fortress that's just carved right out of the dense North American wilderness.
Right, completely isolated.
Exactly. And for days, you've watched this massive enemy force slowly encircle you.
Just tightening the noose.
Yeah. And then the woods suddenly erupt. A 24-pound solid iron cannonball slams into the dry pine wall just feet away from you.
God, the sound of that alone.
But it doesn't just smash the wood, it turns that timber into an explosion of like 1,000 lethal, jagged splinters tearing through the parade ground at ballistic speeds.
Yeah, that's the horrific reality of it.
Today, we are looking at how a meticulously calculated European military equation went horribly violently wrong in the wild forests of colonial New York.
Just a phenomenal case study in what happens when the rigid geometric rules of European siegecraft collide with the raw, unpredictable realities of North American frontier warfare.
Right.
Because the variables that commanders thought they controlled well, they simply did not exist out here.
And to really understand those variables, we're taking you, the listener, straight into the dirt, the timber, and the powder smoke of the siege of Fort William Henry.
We really are getting into the weeds on this.
Oh, absolutely. Our mission for this deep dive is to, strip away the centuries of Hollywood myths, and we will definitely talk about those later.
Oh, we have to.
Right. But we want to uncover the raw, factual ground truth of those fateful days in August.
And we have the perfect source to do exactly that.
Yes, we do. I need to explicitly state right up front that today's deep dive is powered entirely by a massive comprehensive research study by Mick Prichter.
Which is just an incredible piece of work.
It really is. You can find his incredibly detailed work over at battlefieldtravels.com.
And, Prichter's work is essential for this deep dive because it fundamentally shifts how we view the siege. Well, he isn't just relying on those romanticized Victorian accounts. His analysis draws heavily upon primary sources, first-hand physical exploration of the battlefield itself, and this is a really cool part, advanced GIS terrain analysis.
Oh, wow. So actual geographical data.
Exactly. That geographic data is the key.
Mm-hmm.
We aren't just reading about where the French dug their trenches.
Right.
We can actually look at the topographical anomalies that dictated exactly why they dug them there.
That is fascinating. The GIS insights alone completely changed the narrative. But before we get to the trenches, we really need to establish the strategic reality of 1757.
Right. Set the stage.
Anyone familiar with the period knows we are smack in the middle of the 7 Years' War, or, the French and Indian War, as it's known in the North American theater.
Right. The grand struggle.
Exactly. We all know Britain and France are locked in this death match for global supremacy. But I think we often forget how heavily constrained that struggle was by the geography of the North American continent.
Oh, geography was the ultimate dictator of strategy here. I mean, you have to completely discard any modern notions of movement.
Like, you can't just march an army down a paved highway.
No, not at all. Moving an 18th century army, which is essentially a small moving city wearing tons of daily supplies, was practically impossible through the old-growth forests of the Northeast.
So what were their options?
The waterways.
Yeah.
The waterways were the only viable lines of operation.
I mean, it's not just a highway system, it's a strategic interior line. Like, when I look at the map of the corridor running from the St. Lawrence River in French Canada, down through Lake Champlain, into Lake George, and then connecting to the Hudson River Valley, it's massive.
It really is the spine of the region.
Right. It feels less like a road and more like a vital supply line or a strategic choke point in a naval blockade. Like, if you don't hold the line, the enemy just flows right into your heartland.
That is the perfect way to look at it.
Yeah.
Because if the French command that continuous waterway, they can project power from Quebec straight down into Albany.
And ultimately threaten New York City.
Exactly. They can effectively sever the New England colonies from the rest of the British holdings.
Which would be catastrophic for the British. And sitting right in the middle of that artery, acting as this massive timber bastion, is Fort William Henry.
Yep. The cork in the bottle.
The British built it in 1755, right at the southern tip of Lake George. It anchors the British frontier, it guards the approaches to the Hudson Valley, and it just sits there as a constant looming threat to the French bastion of Fort Carillon, which, well, that's Ticonderoga, right?
Right, Ticonderoga.
Huh?
Which was only 35 miles to the north at the top of the lake.
Just 35 miles. That is a very short distance for two hostile empires to share.
It's basically a staring contest across the water.
Mm-hmm.
So Fort William Henry was designed to be an uncompromising obstacle.
Right. Let's talk about the design, because when we look at its construction, it's a classic bastion fort.
Yeah, the gold standard for military architecture at the time, heavily influenced by European engineers like Vauban.
You see this design everywhere European colonial armies operated. I mean, we should probably assume most military history buffs listening understand the basic concept of a bastion fort, right?
Yeah, generally speaking, it's a square or polygon with those jutting diamond-shaped corners.
Right, the bastions. And the whole point of those is to eliminate blind spots, allowing defenders to cover every single inch of the outer wall with overlapping fields of fire.
Exactly. Crossfire is a defender's best friend. But what really stands out in Prichter's research are the specific vulnerabilities of Fort William Henry's layout.
Right, because it wasn't a perfect fortress.
Not at all. Prichter's GIS data highlights a critical flaw. The northwest bastion was built on sandy, relatively unstable soil close to the lake's edge.
Oh, so the foundation was weak.
Yeah, the British engineers worked with the terrain they had, but that soil composition meant the walls there were inherently weaker than a structure founded on solid bedrock.
And I bet the French engineers spotted that immediately.
Oh, they would recognize that vulnerability almost the second they looked at it.
Wow. And there's another crucial physical detail for anyone listening who might have visited the modern site.
Oh, the reconstruction, right?
Yeah, if you go to Lake George today and look at the reconstructed fort, which was built in the 1950s using the original plans, the walls look, well, deceptively low.
Yeah, they really do.
Like, you might think a determined infantry battalion could just throw up some ladders and swarm right over the top.
Right, but that is a visual deception created by the modern reconstruction.
Yeah.
Because the modern site lacks the massive defensive ditch that surrounded the original perimeter in 1757.
Exactly. The dry moat. An attacking force wasn't just running across a flat field to a log wall.
No, not even close.
They had to advance under heavy crossfire, navigate a glacis, which is a sloping bank of earth, descend into a deep engineered ditch, and then attempt to scale the actual fort wall from the very bottom of that depression.
Right, it was designed to completely break the momentum of an infantry assault.
Turn the ditch into a literal killing zone.
Exactly. The structure itself was imposing, especially with that ditch. But, you know, a fort is only as strong as the garrison inside it and the logistics supporting it.
Which brings us to the men actually holding the line. The British defenders, the trapped ones in this scenario, are commanded by Lieutenant Colonel George Monro.
Right, Monro. He is a veteran, a steady Scottish officer.
But placed in a nearly impossible situation, he has a mixed garrison of about 2,200 to 2,300 men.
Which breaks down into a couple of distinct groups.
Yeah, he has 7 companies of his own 35th Regiment of Foot. These are disciplined European regular soldiers who are incredibly proficient at loading and firing muskets in a line.
Right, standard European doctrine.
But maybe they're less adapted to the fluid, decentralized warfare of the deep woods. And then, supplementing them, he has several units of colonial provincial militia.
And the provincials are an interesting element here, because they are rugged, they know the climate, and they understand the terrain far better than the regulars do.
Right.
But they lack the institutional discipline to endure a prolonged static siege under heavy artillery fire.
And the biggest flaw in this whole setup is that Monro knows his resources are finite.
Severely finite.
Right. He is short on heavy ammunition, adequate food stores, and medical supplies. His entire defensive doctrine basically relies on the expectation of relief.
Right. His timber walls can stop musket balls, but not heavy cannon fire indefinitely. He needs backup.
Which brings us to the supposed safety net. General Daniel Webb, who's sitting at Fort Edward, less than 20 miles away.
Less than a day's march.
Right. It's essentially a single day's march down a military road. Now, Webb has been historically pilloried for his actions or, lack thereof during this campaign.
Oh, he's usually painted as the villain, the hesitant coward.
Exactly. But looking at the tactical situation, I really want to challenge that standard narrative of Webb's cowardice for a second. Let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
If Webb is sitting at Fort Edward and his scouts are reporting an overwhelming French invasion force, some estimates were wildly claiming 10,000 men isn't staying put the objectively correct tactical decision.
That's a valid argument.
Right, because if he marches his relief column out there into an ambush and is destroyed, the entire Hudson Valley is left completely undefended.
And that is the exact strategic calculus Webb is running in his head. It highlights a massive intelligence failure on the British side.
The fog of war.
Absolutely. Webb is operating completely in the fog of war. In 1757, you are relying on Rangers and Allied scouts to gauge enemy numbers.
Which is not exactly drone surveillance.
No. And in an environment where the dense canopy of the forest and the acoustic properties of a lake can make a force of 3,000 sound and look like 10,000.
Right, the echoes alone would be terrifying.
Exactly. So Webb becomes psychologically paralyzed. He convinces himself that Fort William Henry is just bait.
Oh, wow.
And if he takes the bait, he loses the entire continent. So he prioritizes the preservation of his army over the relief of Monroe.
Which, while logically sound on paper, leaves Monroe completely isolated as the French juggernaut descends.
Yes, it seals his fate.
And we really need to examine the composition of that French juggernaut because Marquis de Montcalm is not just commanding a monolithic French army.
No, it's far more complicated than that.
He is managing an incredibly fragile, complex coalition of about 7,500 men.
Right. It's the three-pillared force, and each pillar operates under entirely different martial philosophies.
Okay, let's break those down. The first pillar is the corps, right?
Yeah. 3,000 French regulars, regiments like Béarn, Lassar, Royal Roussillon, and Languedoc.
These are the professionals.
Exactly. They're steeped in formal European siege doctrine. They understand exactly how to methodically dismantle a fortification using geometry and heavy artillery.
Right, the engineers. Then the second pillar consists of 3,000 Canadian militia.
And these men are the logistical backbone of the expedition.
Right, they're native to New France, so they're accustomed to the grueling physical labor of frontier campaigning.
They're adept at irregular warfare, but crucially for this siege, they are the ones who are going to be doing the brutal, backbreaking work of digging the siege trenches.
Got it. And then you have the third and probably most volatile pillar,
Right.
roughly 2,000 native allies.
Yes, comprising warriors from numerous nations, primarily the Huron, Abenaki, and Ottawa.
And to understand this siege, we have to dive deep into the sociological mechanics of this alliance, don't we?
It's vital, because what's fascinating here is that Montcalm's ultimate challenge wasn't just defeating the British.
Yeah.
It was managing his own coalition. Montcalm could not just issue orders to the native warriors like he could to his regulars.
Right, because in Algonquian and Iroquoian military traditions, a European general is not a dictator.
No, he is merely a persuasive influence. He's a partner, not a boss.
That's a crucial distinction. The native warriors aren't mercenaries receiving a daily wage from the French crown. They are sovereign allies engaged in a specific military contract.
Exactly. And their contract demands compensation.
Which takes the form of plunder, captives, and the martial honor that comes from a successful raid.
Yes. For the native coalition, going to war without securing those tangible spoils is culturally and economically irrational. Their motives were deeply rooted in preserving influence and securing those spoils.
Right. They provide Montcalm with indispensable reconnaissance, they screen his army from British Rangers, and they project an aura of terror that demoralizes the enemy.
But Montcalm is constantly balancing on a razor's edge.
Because he needs to show strength without losing native trust.
Exactly. It's a delicate, precarious equilibrium. Too little plunder, they walk away. Too much leniency, atrocities occur. He has to demonstrate enough military success to keep them engaged, but he is terrified that if he allows them to operate according to their own martial traditions, it will stain his European honor.
It's a profound clash of worldviews operating within the exact same army.
It really is.
And Montcalm leverages the sheer scale of this coalition brilliantly during the initial approach. So let's talk about that approach. It's late July 1757. Montcalm has marshaled his forces at Crown Point and Ticonderoga.
And he doesn't attempt to sneak his army down Lake George through the woods.
No, he puts them right on the water. It's psychological warfare.
Oh, absolutely. It is a massive display of force projection. 250 bateaux and canoes moving in disciplined formation down the pristine waters of the lake.
I try to picture the psychological impact of that sight. You are standing on the ramparts of Fort William Henry. The lake is surrounded by steep, heavily forested mountains. It's usually completely silent.
Just nature.
Right. And then, rounding the point, comes this endless flotilla. You have bateaux packed with French regulars in their white coats, sunlight catching the bayonets.
And the artillery barges carrying massive 24-pounder siege guns.
And swarming the flanks of this rigid column are hundreds of birch bark canoes filled with native warriors darting in and out. It wasn't just an advance, It was a deliberate theatrical attempt to overawe and paralyze the British command.
And it works perfectly on General Webb. The scouts rush back to Fort Edward with these panicked, terrifying reports, which prompts Webb to write his fateful letter on August 3rd.
Right, the letter.
Yeah.
It is one of the most chilling documents in colonial military history.
It really seals their fate.
Webb effectively tells Monro that no reinforcements are coming. He says, make a brave defense and then surrender.
It's a bureaucratic death sentence.
Literally.
Oh.
And while that letter is making its perilous journey through the woods, Montcalm lands his army at the southern tip of Lake George. It's August 3rd, and the fort is completely cut off.
The investment phase begins.
Right. The native allies screen the woods, cutting off the road to Fort Edward, while the French regulars begin the meticulous work of a Vauban's siege.
Yeah, Sébastien Leprestre de Vauban's textbook methods. His 17th century treatises on siegecraft were essentially the holy texts for European military engineers.
It's all about geometry.
Exactly. It was a standardized mathematical approach to capturing a fort while minimizing your own infantry casualties. You don't charge the walls, you dig your way to them.
So the Canadian militia and the engineers begin digging what's called the first parallel. I was looking at Prichter's diagrams of the French trench lines, and they don't just dig a straight line toward the fort.
Oh, definitely not.
Right. They dig a trench parallel to the fort to safely bring up the heavy artillery, and then they advance using zigzag trenches, or saps.
Right, sapping.
At first glance, you might think they're just routing around large trees or rocks, but there is a brutal ballistic logic to that geometry, isn't there?
Oh, the geometry is entirely dictated by the defender's lines of sight. If you dig a trench straight toward a fort, the defenders on the wall can fire a cannonball that will travel straight down the length of your trench.
Just wiping out everyone inside it.
Exactly. It's called enfilading fire. By digging in a zigzag pattern, you ensure that no single stretch of the trench ever points directly at the enemy's guns.
You are always presenting a sharp angle to incoming fire, constantly deflecting it.
Right.
It makes me think of digging parallels like a slow, creeping envelopment by infantry. It's a methodical, unavoidable tightening of the noose that leaves the defender absolutely nowhere to run.
It's mechanical and relentless. And Prichter's GIS analysis reveals something incredible about how the French executed this specific siege.
Oh, right, the terrain anomaly.
Yes, they didn't just dig blindly according to the textbook. The terrain data shows that the French engineers perfectly utilized a subtle natural depression in the earth to mask the construction of their first parallel.
Wow.
This topographical anomaly effectively shielded their sappers from British line-of-sight artillery fire, allowing them to construct their initial gun batteries much faster and far closer than standard doctrine would normally dictate.
See, that is the kind of geographic detail that changes everything about how we understand the timeline. Because they utilized that depression, by August 6th, the French heavy batteries are fully operational.
And this is when the Iron Storm truly begins.
The bombardment of Fort William Henry was just a concentrated application of horrific violence. The French bring up 24-pounder siege cannons and heavy mortars targeting the wooden walls.
And we have to understand the sheer kinetic energy of a 24-pound solid iron ball traveling at supersonic speeds.
Right. We touched on this earlier, but it bears repeating because it really dictates the entire tactical situation for Monro.
It changes the math completely.
If you fire an iron cannonball against a European stone or masonry fortress, the wall chips, it cracks, eventually it crumbles. But Fort William Henry is made of tightly packed earth faced with massive pine logs.
Exactly.
When that iron hits the dry pine, the wood doesn't just absorb the blow, it literally shatters.
The mechanics of the damage are devastating. The cannonball acts as a blunt wedge, displacing the timber with such explosive force that it generates hundreds of jagged wooden projectiles.
Like massive shrapnel.
Yes. Men inside the fort weren't just being killed by direct hits from the cannonballs. They were being shredded by the splintering timber of their own fortress.
God. And while the cannons are battering the walls, the mortars are attacking the interior.
Yeah, mortars are a completely different beast.
They don't fire on a flat trajectory. They lob massive explosive bombs in a high parabolic arc, dropping them directly over the walls to detonate in the cramped parade ground.
It creates a three-dimensional threat environment. The defenders have absolutely no safe cover.
None.
A mortar shell would embed itself in the dirt of the parade ground, the fuse hissing for a terrifying second before detonating. It throws packed earth, shrapnel, and concussive force in every direction.
You read the primary accounts from inside the fort, and the sensory overload is unimaginable.
Oh, it had to be mind-breaking.
The barracks roofs are caving in. The British are desperately covering their powder magazines with wet animal hides, just terrified that a stray spark from a mortar burst will ignite their reserves and vaporize the entire garrison.
And casualties mount from falling beams and the thick smoke, not just enemy fire.
Right, and the ambient conditions inside are rapidly deteriorating. The powder smoke settles over the fort like a heavy fog, making it impossible to breathe.
The psychological toll of that unending noise, heavy artillery firing hour after hour, it creates a deep psychological exhaustion. Men are deafened by the blasts, blinded by the smoke.
And then by August 7th and 8th, the French tighten the vise even further. The zigzag saps have progressed close enough to establish a second parallel.
Bringing the French muskets into effective range.
Yes. Monro's men are now being raked with crossfire from multiple angles. And it's not just the French ordnance that's killing them, it is August in New York.
Oh, the heat.
The summer heat turns the water foul. The sanitation systems within the confined space of the fort completely collapse. Food runs out.
Camp fever and dysentery sweep through the garrison with terrifying speed.
The makeshift hospitals are overflowing.
Right, stacked alongside those suffering from horrific shrapnel wounds, all while the roof is literally vibrating from the impacts above.
And the psychological pressure doesn't ease when the sun goes down either.
No, the nights were arguably worse.
The heavy cannons might pause their firing in the darkness, but the eerie nighttime silence is punctuated by the native warriors positioned in the woods around the fort, crying out and firing sporadically into the darkness.
It was shredding British morale. The provincial militia, who are already struggling with the static nature of the siege, are pushed to the brink of mutiny.
Monro only manages to hold them together purely through the discipline of his regulars and this fading hope that Webb will march to their rescue.
But then, on August 8th, the final blow lands.
Right. Webb's final communication, that letter from August 3rd, which had actually been intercepted by the French, is delivered to Monro under a flag of truce by Montcalm's aide.
It is a devastating moment of clarity for Monro.
So, what does this all mean for Monro? How does a veteran commander swallow that pill?
Well, he reads the words of his commanding officer, effectively telling him he is abandoned. He's advising him that his honor is intact and surrender is preferable to annihilation.
I mean, his own artillery is mostly dismounted or destroyed. His powder is critically low.
His men are sick, starving, and exhausted after 6 days of continuous bombardment. He has hit the breaking point.
So he faces the ultimate command decision. He has fulfilled the requirements of his honor. He has held out as long as humanly possible against an overwhelmingly superior force.
There's nothing left to do.
On the morning of August 9th, the guns fall silent, and Monro raises the white flag.
And this initiates the formal negotiation of the capitulation. Montcalm offers Monro the honors of war.
We really need to break down the mechanics of the honors of war because it is the linchpin to the tragic aftermath. What does it actually mean for a garrison to be granted these terms?
It's a deeply entrenched tradition in 18th century European military culture. It's a way for a victorious commander to acknowledge the bravery of a defeated enemy who conducted a stout defense according to the formal rules of siegecraft.
So they aren't treated as subjugated prisoners of war?
No, not at all. Monro's men are permitted to march out of Fort William Henry in full military formation. They keep their regimental colors flying. Their drummers are allowed to beat a march.
Right.
And crucially, the soldiers are allowed to carry their muskets on their shoulders.
But with one massive caveat, right? Their cartridge boxes are empty. They have absolutely no ammunition.
Exactly. It is a symbolic retention of their martial dignity. But practically speaking, they are disarmed.
Got it.
Furthermore, they are allowed to retain their personal baggage, and Montcalm promises them a safe escort of French regulars down the military road back to Fort Edward.
And what happens to the sick and severely wounded men who physically cannot make that march?
The terms stipulate that the sick and wounded are to be left behind under the temporary care of French military surgeons until they are well enough to be transported back to British lines.
Okay, so from the perspective of Monro and Montcalm, this is a civilized, honorable end. The mathematical equation of the siege has been solved. The statecraft concludes with a gentleman's agreement.
Right. But they severely miscalculated the views of a crucial third party.
The native allies.
Exactly. That agreement completely ignored the sociological reality of the army Montcalm was commanding. If we connect this to the bigger picture, we really have to look at the two distinct concepts of warfare at play here.
Right, the cultural clash.
For Montcalm, war is about territory and European honor. You sign a piece of paper, the fort changes hands, the campaign is a success.
But for the native warriors, warfare involves acquiring captives, plunder, and symbols of honor.
Exactly. To them, Montcalm signing away the spoils of a hard-fought siege was a direct betrayal of their alliance.
Because Montcalm signed a piece of paper that essentially guarantees the British can walk away with their lives, their personal wealth, and their weapons.
It wasn't just baffling, it was a violation of their martial contract. For the Huron, the Abenaki, the Ottawa, war requires compensation for the risk to their lives and the expenditure of their resources.
That compensation is the plunder, weapons, clothing, tools, and the captives.
Right. By granting the honors of war, Montcalm unilaterally negotiated away the very spoils that justified the native warriors' participation in the first place.
He essentially told his vital allies, hey, thank you for securing my flanks and terrifying the garrison into submission, but you get nothing. The British get to take it all home.
It was perceived as a massive, unforgivable betrayal. In their view, the French had broken the alliance. Therefore, the native warriors felt entirely justified in stepping outside of Montcalm's authority to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs.
Which brings us to the tragedy on the morning of August 10th. The British column forms up outside the entrenched camp, and it is a sprawling, vulnerable mass of humanity. We are talking about the disarmed regulars, the provincial militia, the sick who could walk, as well as the camp followers, women, children.
And their dragging wagons of baggage.
Right. As this massive, unwieldy column attempts to leave, the fragile discipline completely collapses.
Deprived of their expected spoils, the native warriors surge right into the British column.
The primary accounts of the ensuing chaos are just harrowing. The warriors first target the baggage train. They begin seizing muskets, ripping coats off the backs of the soldiers, taking hats, blankets.
Panic instantly ripples through the disarmed British column.
And when individuals in the column attempt to resist having their possessions taken, the physical confrontation rapidly escalates into lethal violence.
The sheer terror of the situation causes the column to fracture. People start running for the woods. Stragglers at the rear are pulled down.
And the sick and wounded who had been left in the fort's hospital, they were attacked too, right?
Tragically, yes.
We often hear the term massacre thrown around regarding this, and it conjures up images of total annihilation. It is crucial to address the reality of the command structure in this moment. Why didn't Montcalm just order his 3,000 regulars to fire on the native warriors and stop it?
Because Montcalm's authority over the native coalition had instantly evaporated the moment he broke their martial contract. He couldn't just order them to stop.
Right, because he's not a dictator.
Exactly. Eyewitness accounts from both French and British sources confirmed that Montcalm and his senior officers were actually horrified by the breakdown in order. They rode directly into the fray.
Desperately pleading with the chiefs, right?
Yes, attempting to use his personal influence. There are accounts of French officers physically throwing themselves in front of British soldiers, taking blows to shield them.
But the influence of a general in the Algonquian tradition only extends as far as his ability to provide success and spoils. Since his authority was gone, his words carried zero weight.
And if he ordered his regulars to open fire on his own allies, he risked triggering a massive three-way bloodbath.
The native coalition could have turned entirely against the French army right there in the wilderness.
It was a catastrophic loss of control. Eventually, the sheer presence of the French regulars managed to establish a perimeter around the bulk of the terrified British survivors, and they escorted the shattered remnants down the road to Fort Edward.
But the toll was already taken. The casualty numbers have been heavily debated and, often wildly exaggerated by contemporary propaganda.
Right.
But modern historical consensus, supported by research like Prichter's, estimates that between 70 and 150 British soldiers and camp followers were killed in the chaos.
And those deaths, while tragic, are only part of the toll. Many more were violently pulled from the column and carried off into the deep forest as captives.
That is a terrifying fate to contemplate. What happened to them?
Their fates varied wildly. Some were eventually ransomed back to the French, who then returned them to the British. Others were subjected to ritualized torture and execution, which was the deeply ingrained aspect of the mourning wars tradition for some native nations, serving to avenge their own fallen warriors.
Wow.
And many simply vanished from the colonial historical record entirely. They were permanently adopted into native communities to replace lost members, eventually becoming fully integrated.
It's just a dark Incredibly complex human tragedy, and the strategic fallout from the siege and the massacre fundamentally altered the trajectory of the 7 Years' War.
It really did.
Because Montcalm had achieved this monumental tactical victory. He had smashed the lock on the Hudson Valley, he had an open road to Fort Edward, and beyond that, Albany. But he doesn't march. He destroys Fort William Henry and withdraws back to Canada.
Right.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. Why win the battle just to walk away?
Well, this is where the unglamorous reality of 18th century logistics rears its head. Montcalm realizes it is functionally impossible to exploit his victory.
He can't feed them.
Yeah, exactly. He cannot sustain an army of over 7,000 men that deep in enemy territory. His supply lines back up the lake are stretched to the breaking point.
Not to mention the composition of his army is rapidly dissolving.
Yes, his native alliance is completely fractured. The warriors, having secured their captives and plunder, are already leaving to return to their villages. Furthermore, his Canadian militia, the labor force of his army, have to be released.
Why?
If they don't return to New France in time to harvest the autumn crops, the entire French colony will starve during the winter. Montcalm is out of time and out of supplies.
So he makes the only logical military decision available. He orders his engineers to systematically dismantle Fort William Henry. They burn the massive pine logs, they collapse the casemates, and they withdraw, leaving behind a smoking, desolate crater.
A hollow victory, and a crater that would instantly become the most potent propaganda weapon of the entire 18th century.
Oh, absolutely. The narrative of the massacre at Fort William Henry hits the colonial printing presses, and it creates a transatlantic firestorm of outrage.
The British authorities aggressively weaponize the tragedy. They push a narrative of innate French treachery and the sheer barbarity of the savage allies.
And the nuance of Montcalm's desperate attempts to stop the violence is entirely erased from the public consciousness.
Completely erased. And the political effect is staggering. The war is suddenly viewed as a brutal existential threat to their own homes and families. The British use the outrage to rally massive colonial militia recruitment.
While conversely, the French strategic position is fundamentally hollowed out. The alliance between the French and the natives is permanently fractured.
Both sides feel betrayed.
Right. And that renewed British fury directly fuels the massive, successful counteroffensives of 1758 and 1759. They pour men and money into the theater, eventually capturing Quebec.
Fort William Henry really was the high-wire mark of French power in the colonies. Everything after the massacre was a slow, inevitable retreat.
Now, given all of this massive geopolitical consequence, it's entirely possible that the siege of Fort William Henry might have simply remained a footnote in academic military journals. But it didn't.
No, it didn't.
And that is almost entirely due to a single author named James Fenimore Cooper.
Ah, yes. In 1826, Cooper publishes the historical novel The Last of the Mohicans. He takes the historical framework of the siege, the surrender, and the massacre, and he uses it as the dramatic backdrop for a sweeping romantic narrative.
And it becomes an absolute global phenomenon. The Last of the Mohicans has never been out of print since 1826. It cemented the siege into global pop culture forever.
It's been adapted into film and television over a dozen times. Specifically, you have the 1936 film version starring Randolph Scott, which was a massive hit.
But for most modern listeners, the definitive visual representation is the 1992 cinematic epic starring Daniel Day-Lewis.
Right. Now, from a strict historian's perspective, the film takes massive liberties with the timeline and the exact sequence of events.
But what it gets absolutely right is the atmosphere. It brilliantly captures the sheer scale of the wilderness, the terror of the artillery bombardment, and the visceral reality of that cultural collision.
It kept the memory of Fort William Henry alive for generations. It inspires people to look past the fiction and seek out the true history.
Which brings us back to the physical battlefield today. If you drive to Lake George in modern New York, you aren't just looking at an empty field. You can visit the reconstructed fort.
It is a remarkable sight to experience.
Like we mentioned, it was rebuilt in the 1950s on the exact footprint of the original 1755 structure. While it lacks the dry moat, the scale of the bastions gives you a profound sense of the space.
They have living history interpreters conducting musket drills, which gives you a tiny taste of the concussive noise that the garrison endured.
And the museum inside is filled with artifacts pulled straight out of the Burt, deformed musket balls, rusted buttons, fragments of exploded mortar shells. You can stand up on the walls, look out over the lake, and you can easily imagine the terrifying sight of Montcalm's flotilla sliding out of the mist.
It's a tangible connection to the past. And, it's a place that demands serious reflection.
Absolutely.
If I can leave you, the listener, with one final thought to mull over, it is this. This wasn't just a clash of empires over a stretch of water. It was a tragic collision of entirely different worldviews on the rules of war.
Right.
When formal European military protocol was blindly imposed on the complex, pre-existing cultural dynamics of North America, disaster was inevitable. It begs the question, how often in military history does the true danger lie not in the enemy's weapons, but in a commander's failure to understand the cultural realities of his own alliance?
That is the core lesson. Well, we want to wrap up by thanking you, our listener, for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a fascinating journey.
And we must explicitly thank BattlefieldTravels.com and the phenomenal research of Mick Prichter for making this analysis possible. Please head over to their site to access additional information, maps, and hundreds of other in-depth battle and campaign studies. Until next time, keep looking past the myths.